right, welcome back, everybody. At the end of the day, we have elections so we can decide policy. We can elect policymakers to represent us, to implement and execute laws and policies. And so we're going to pivot a little bit to talking about technology and policy, both how it plays out in the Congress, both this Congress and maybe the next Congress, but also a little bit about how some of those issues might be talked about during the campaigns, or whether they will be talked about in the campaigns and what extent they may impact voters' decision-making. For this session, Rick Burke, who is the executive editor of Politico, is going to lead our conversation. Rick was an IOP fellow in the late 90s. After a great career, even at that point with the New York Times, as one of their top political reporters, ultimately became an editor before joining Politico a few years ago. And he's been on our senior advisory committee of the Institute of Politics for a long time. And so we're really glad to have him here. I see in the audience some potential future fellows, and hopefully you'll get a chance to have as great of an experience as Rick did and continue to be involved with our organization. Rick wants me to ask all of you, when you get called on, please identify yourself and your organization for the benefit of everybody. We're going to be sticklers on that for this session. And also maybe, Rick, to make it easier for you to see people, rather than trying to raise your hand, take your card and put it up like this. That way, if you have a question, you don't need to keep your hand up the whole time. We can see those cards, and then we can call on people accordingly. And once you've answered or made your comment or asked your question, you put it back down. Then we'll know that you're finished with that particular point. And you put it back up, you can do it again. But that'll make it easier for Rick. Rick, take it from here.
Great. Why don't, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you to indulge me for a second because I thought I would tell you about how I played a small role, admittedly, in enlightening my fellow reporters and other people on Capitol Hill on technology. And the year was 1985. Many of you were not around at all, let alone DC. So I was a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun, and I was covering a hearing on Capitol Hill. And do you all remember, do any of you know that the computer of choice in 1985 was made by Radio Shack? Yeah. The trash TR-80s, we called them TRS-80s. We called them trash 80s. And they had, I think, three, Dan, you remember this, right? They had like 3 lines.
I wasn't around then.
They had like 3 lines, maybe 4 lines of type, and green, green letters. And you had to kind of look down at it, and when you filed a story, you had to connect like the muffs on the thing and hope it would go through. But anyway, at that time, the Baltimore Sun decided to spend some money, so they gave me one of the first TRS 100s. And the TRS 100 was a huge, big deal because it had a flip top thing, or flip screen. So I went to this hearing in 1985 on Capitol Hill, and I dramatically flipped open my TRS 100, and there was like, like everyone in the room, like reporters. I don't know if any members of Congress, but it was like it was a really important moment in sort of a teachable moment for people on Capitol Hill to learn about what technology could bring to Congress. So that's
Congress, they're still using that.
Right. So we're talking about, as promised, privacy, patents, innovation, and why don't we start with privacy? But the thing that's striking, I think, to all of us is there have been all these promises from the administration about reforms and law and measures that have been proposed, and not much progress has been made in the way of protections or privacy. And I just wanted to start on that note. But Michael, why don't you give your sense of whether privacy or any general overview you want to put forth?
Sure, just on privacy or on all those issues?
Start on privacy? Yeah, why don't you start on privacy?
Yeah, privacy certainly is an important area, and I think when you look at industries and you look at individual companies, there aren't many or any that take this issue more seriously than ours, because user trust is the hallmark of the internet. the relationship that companies have with internet users, and it's a highly competitive space. Companies are popping up all the time, and there's a lot of choice on the internet, and so trust is very important. And one of the key privacy issues I think we'll talk about is ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. And so you mentioned 1985. The following year is the year where ECPA came about. And that 1986 law, which I'm sure the world in 1986, as I remembered it, was very much like 1985, and it's very different than today. And so law that was passed signed into law in 1986 is still governing the way that law enforcement is able to access our electronic communications today. And that law needs to be updated. And so we feel that the same protections that apply to you when you have a letter that's in your mailbox should apply to your email, and the same laws that protect your communications that you have in a filing cabinet should apply to your cloud storage. And
Well,
so that's one.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this flurry of proposals, but there's been no update. Why is that? Anyone? What's been the paralysis?
Congress hasn't acted on, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Sorry, Nicole Isaac, the group. Congress has not yet acted on ECPA reform. So as you know, Senator Leahy has a proposal that's out there. I understand that Chairman Goodlatte is still working on a bill. However, like many other things in Congress, they've yet to come together on what the specific proposal should look like for purposes of reauthorization and expansion of the law. And so you have Goodlatte on one side talking about geolocation efforts, but it's unclear that the Senate would expand in that way.
but why is that? Do they not agree on what the main issue is? I mean, what's the reason for the lack of any kind of progress?
I defer to others here who
Others?
are also experts.
It's not a hell of a lot of progress in anything.
Is there anything more specific?
No.
Really? Yeah.
I think on ECPA, part of the reason that there's no action is it's been largely overshadowed by the Patriot Act and NSA surveillance reform. Because as people talk about what it means to have access to certain kinds of data, the ECPA piece of it on the 180 days and what the legal standard is there in terms of domestic law enforcement is getting overshadowed by this broader question about what the government is doing to access Americans' data under the Patriot Act and other things. So it gets caught up in that debate, and it seems like such a small piece of the privacy umbrella that people, I think, are unwilling to move that until they can talk about the broader questions.
And some of the broader questions are some of Obama's proposed reforms. Is it some of those same issues that he's had? Is that why he's having trouble?
Yeah, I think that's right. The president has proposed a series of reforms in response to the continuing Edward Snowden revelations, but some of those are very difficult to implement technically. So you don't see the same kind, and they're also very controversial inside the administration, so you don't see the same kind of motion on that that you would if you saw congressional action. It's just not as transparent to voters.
And I also think legally, some of those reforms you're just unable to act on through the executive, through the administration. I mean, some of these reforms would require legislative action, such as bulk collection under 215, which the president has been very clear about concerns on. But that's exactly right. It's this dichotomy between the need to act and the need to act soon in a time when Congress, frankly, is intransigent and is not moving anything.
Does everyone agree with what the, yes?
Sorry, hi, Lee Freund with AOL. I think part of the issue is that, first of all, these issues are complicated. And nobody wants to be on record as being against our security, right? So obviously, we as internet companies all recognize the need for our government to have information about threats against our security. We, however, Michael mentioned it before, have a real interest in user trust. So we have a primary relationship with those consumers, and we've already told them what we do with their information. We try to be open and transparent. So I think part of the challenge here is how transparent can we be? We are restricted, obviously, by law, but how transparent can the government be on sharing this information with consumers? So I think that, the transparency question and education on what these types of things are, what information is being collected and how we can do it is a real challenge in this political environment when we're talking about, on the opposite side, U.S. security.
You talked about consumer trust. How much are you at AOL thinking about or worried about a consumer backlash, that they're amassing too much private information on us?
Yeah, so I think, we're already seeing it. I think all of the internet companies are seeing it. We've combined together as a coalition to talk about these NSA revelations and about reforms. And it has a very negative effect. We look at our incoming comments from our users, and they're concerned about this very thing. So, again, the companies try to be pretty open and transparent through privacy policies, communications with our users, and other things about the type of information we collect. But what we're finding is that they're fearful of what they don't know. So, we also understand some of the revelations that are coming out now about the backdoor entrance into our companies and the information that's being collected is concerning everybody. And we're also being affected on an international basis. So our users are global in many of our companies. And that really is a challenge to us continuing to do a global business. And we're concerned about that. The whole is greater than any one of our parts here. So that you find 8 or 9 or 10 or the number of internet companies that are members of the Internet Association even combining on this type of issue in such a unified voice really tells you how important it is to our consumer base.
Are you finding, are people more nervous or paranoid consumers about online communications or telephone communications? And what's your sense?
Rick,
Yeah.
John
Have you
Delvaux.
surveyed?
John Delvaux. We surveyed a series of questions in our poll from the fall. Again, just millennials, but we kind of prefaced it based on for the sake of national security, how much are you willing to give up? And we asked a series of questions around your text, your email, social network activity, web browsing activity, GPS location, et cetera. And we found that generally speaking, 30% of young people are willing to share their social network activity, generally, for the sake of national security. Okay? And the more specific it got, the more personal it got, the lower the number went. So from 7 out of 10 to no, not even general information, all the way down to text, phone calls, and emails, were about 13, 15%. Generally. Then we said, specifically to you, would you be willing to share your personal data for the sake of national security? And the numbers were basically in half of that. So rather than 30% generally for everybody, 19% would share their own social networking activity, or 14% would allow their phone calls to be tapped, traced, whatever. So, and that's obviously having set that for national security to begin with. So those could be conservative numbers.
Does that fit in, Michael, with what your sense is?
Sure. I'm not going to dispute your polling.
No, but does that,
But that's-
gut-wise, does that, right?
But it might be different with older, those are millennials.
Those are young people. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly would vary by age group.
And do you find that the telephone, the companies that are dealing more with telephone versus online are more focused on this or not? Or is it, I know it's not.
I think there's generally a trend that people are getting rid of their landlines and going more to mobile. And like from our previous discussion, the screens that people are watching, it's a little bit less on live TV and more to your tablet, smartphone, and time delay programs. So certainly the market is changing and people's expectations are also changing.
Now, and just getting back to why Congress hasn't done anything beyond the general overall horrible paralysis that Frank talked about. Is it because the public isn't pushing for reform? Even though there's this nervousness and unease, are members of Congress really not feeling any pressure, any heat on this, on these issues? What's your sense?
mean, I think on the ECPA side, on law enforcement, I don't know, I haven't seen any polling, but my guess would be if you polled somebody and said, do the same rules on warrants and your Fourth Amendment rights that you enjoy in the physical world, do they extend to the digital world? I think most people would say yes. I think most people, if you ask them, does a law enforcement agency need a warrant to get your email that you've had over 180 days the same way they would need to get a warrant to look at a piece of mail? I think most people would just assume yes, and that's just not the case. And so part of it is an education piece.
I think for most members of Congress, they're not as engaged in this because there's not a clear path forward as to what people should be doing. This is very different than when you had SOPA and PIPA and CISPA, where it was very clear, there's a piece of legislation, it's moving, stop it. There was a huge grassroots movement, and most members of Congress heard from their constituents and voters on that. With the ECPA, NSA surveillance reform, there are competing bills, there are competing equities. The administration is also proposing changes, so it's not clear for voters how they would direct their members of Congress to act. They can't call in and say, vote yes on this or vote no on that, and you don't see the same kind of grassroots swell that you saw around other tech issues.
One of the things I would say is that we still don't know everything. We had another release come out just, I believe, yesterday or today about malware being distributed by the NSA. And I think a lot of members are right now waiting to find out what else is out there before they try to put together a piece of legislation to address the concerns of that program. So.
Where do you think this all ends up? Do you think there will be progress in these areas in terms of congressional reform or action?
I mean, I think people try to address it, and whether the legislative branch and the executive branch can come to terms on that will be an issue that we'll see how it plays out. I think, regardless of, and I think there's still a lot of things that are unknown about this, but the CIA story involving the Senate Intel Committee, that's a serious breach between the executive branch and the legislative branch, especially when it comes to checks and balances and the constitutional rights of the country. So I think if members weren't upset before, there are a lot more that are upset now.
What's the, how does it break down? I don't know if we have figures on it, but I'd be curious how this breaks down demographically in terms of minority groups and various income levels, and how much people care about these issues related to, like Hispanic voters, for instance. Where do they fit in all this in terms of their interest in this issue versus other voters? Any thoughts?
No pressure or anything.
No, sorry.
What we tend to find, even among voters, is that there's a very low-level information. So the deep dive into policies are really fascinating because we find time and time again, immigration is a perfect example, and where people get polled, Hispanic voters get polled, and like, yes, 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 it's very important to me. And then you just do a little bit of a deep dive, and they really don't understand, for the most part, sort of the intricacies of the legislation, who's blocking it, who's supporting it. They know that, well, at this point, because the groups have gotten together great messaging, or effective messaging, that basically this administration has deported more undocumented immigrants than any other administration in the past. So that's a talking point. But I would venture to say that there's just so much noise out there that it's really hard to get to the deep dive of the policy issues and sort of where they stand on each. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But then that requires a lot of targeting. And specifically, we talked earlier in the previous panel about all of the different platforms. So how is it that we reach them? And pollsters, especially because of the challenges between the cell phone and non-cell phone use, because African Americans and Latinos over-index on mobile phones. So they've actually jumped computers and home computers and are getting their information on mobile phones.
Isn't that true, though, with all groups, that most people, most voters, or is it unfair for me to say most voters don't really know the intricacies of legislative twists and policy twists and turns?
I would say yes. But among Hispanic voters, unfortunately, it's just even, it's even worse, I think.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about working people just trying to get shelter for their family and get good jobs, right? Those are the everyday things. So whatever is on the news is really going to be those segments that they read on their phones or watching on television.
We're talking, I mean, even in the last survey that we did with young people, again, the people who should be, in some cases, the most sensitive because they have the most online information, half of them were unsure whether Ed Snowden was a patriot or traitor. We offered them the question just a couple months ago. So it's a question, again, it's a question that we think about when we debate a lot kind of inside the Beltway, but when you kind of widen the lens and think about the lives of young people, you know, throughout the middle of America, it's something just they're not cognizant of yet, you know, which I think explains the other point you made about why, you know, you haven't seen a lobby, you haven't seen a lot of grassroots organizing around some of these initiatives. I was pretty surprised, frankly, at the high number of folks, majority, said they don't have enough information to know at this point. You know,
About Snowden?
About Snowden 7 months in.
But couldn't you argue that, like, they do know about Snowden, but it's a complicated, you know, like, I could argue it either way pretty easily. I could, you know.
Yeah.
No, seriously, you could do a pretty good point, counterpoint.
I do think, I don't think that this conversation has matured yet to where they're having, you know, conversations kind of with their friends, you know, in coffee shops, at work, at school, and those sorts of things yet, when you get outside the Beltway, in terms of what I'm seeing.
Now, I want to think back to, when I think of technology, policy, and lawmakers, I think early on of Al Gore and how he had a reputation for, whether he invented the internet or not, he had that reputation of being savvy about technology. I think about Senator McCain when he was running for president, and he was asked how much he goes on the web, and he said at the time that he's more and more, his staff prints out stuff from the homepage and then he reads it. And the reason I bring this up is not to make fun of our leaders and politicians, but to ask you how important a grasp of an understanding of technology is in your everyday life if you are a member of Congress, and how important that is in terms of legislative initiative and understanding policy. Does it not even matter, or does it? And Michael, I'll start.
Yeah, I think it's very important, and you know, at each year that goes on, as the technology improves and Congress is adopting it more, it becomes more important. And voters know the difference. Voters know the difference between someone that's authentic and is really making the Facebook post themselves and is using their own Instagram feed and is using Twitter versus the ones where it's just their staff and it's kind of, you know, a little bit contrived. You know, if you go to our website, for example, internetassociation.org, you can put in the zip code of your zip code, and you can pull up your member of Congress and your senator, and you can see, do they have a Twitter feed? You know, are they on Facebook? Are they on Google Plus? Do they have a website? What's their email? And not every member has it. I mean, it's getting to the point where it's almost 100% adoption rate of social media, but it's not quite there. And I think it's probably still a minority of members of Congress and senators that are tweeting on their own or posting on Facebook on their own. And voters know the difference. I mean, the level of authenticity.
So if you have a member who tweets regularly, are they better? Do they have a better grasp of policy? I mean, is that really a fair?
It doesn't necessarily mean they have a better grasp of policy. They might have a better grasp of technology, and they're realizing that's how they can reach their constituents and their voters, because this is a platform where people are now. So it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Massey with Lyft. I would say that that's important, especially as some technology and innovation is meeting everyone's everyday life. So we live in the sharing economy. Our company in particular is in the sharing economy. And, you know, whether it's Congress or it's local mayors, county executives, state legislators, governors, you know, everything that they're looking at from a regulatory or a legislative standpoint has to fit in with what they're doing with their everyday life. And when we go to hearings in Congress and we're talking about advanced sharing economy concepts, and some members are still talking about Craigslist, which, fine, but is not really living up to where we are from an innovative standpoint, then there's going to be problems with how they develop legislation going forward. You know, it's always helpful if you have, members of Congress or their staff that have utilized some of these tools so they can really understand it. And I think we're seeing more of that. I think we're seeing more adoption, whether it be, in Tampa, you've got Mayor Buckhorn, who's really heavy on social media, versus some of the old line members who may still have an old-fashioned phone in their office. They don't have a cell phone.
Are you stunned by some of what you hear from members still talking about, like Craigslist? I mean, are you stunned by the lack of awareness?
Well, I think I'm stunned by the lack of awareness of how it fits in within sort of the law and a rulemaking that we have now. So for us, as an example, we operate a ride-sharing platform. None of the regulations that exist currently had this kind of innovation in mind at the time when they were written. They were written for horse and buggies in some cases. So you've got to have lawmakers that are willing to look at those old line rules and figure out a way to make them not only innovative for now, but what's going to happen in the future. And that's very hard to do.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think what's interesting on the ads from the marketing standpoint of it is, in talking to members about it, is that members who have backgrounds in things that are sales focused, and particularly in the auto industry, there are a lot of members of Congress who own car dealerships, not a lot, but there are a couple. And talking to them about it, they have almost an intuitive grasp of understanding about how to use the internet for marketing, because they're using for their campaigns, because they're using those same tools to get people into their car dealerships. So to the extent that we're able to talk about our tools in terms of their business background, they're the most receptive and the most able to just easily grasp what we're talking about.
And I would add, I even think how they're operating their offices is starting to change. I mean, you're starting to look at a change from the old franking privilege to real outreach from a digital standpoint.
Go ahead.
On this, I spent 12 years on the Hill and staffed members of Congress on a lot of these tech issues, and it is incredibly frustrating, the lack of knowledge that they have and the lack of understanding. Some of them, because they are not adopters of technology, don't really understand mobile, and so they don't understand the extent to which technology is in people's lives. Some of them don't have familiarity with the industry, so they're not actually reaching out and asking people how industry works. When the Bush administration proposed their cybersecurity initiative, I was working for Anna Eshoo, who represents Silicon Valley, and she wanted to know what tech industry thought about the administration's proposal, and we scoured the valley to try and find companies who knew what was going on, and the administration had not reached out to them and talked to them about a fundamental policy that was going to affect everything that they did. So the lack of communication for policymakers to industry, not just in Congress, but in the administration, is very low. And so it does two things. One, you have people who don't really understand what the environment is that they're trying to regulate. And number two, because the process is so slow, they're often regulating and leaving rules in place when the technology is moving much faster than that, and it doesn't fit the solution that the technology is actually representing.
Does it matter that, as an example, that Cory Booker, the fact that he tweets constantly, is that good or bad in terms of your issues? I mean, do you respect him more? Oh, he gets us, or do you think, like, what's this guy tweeting constantly? Doesn't he have a job to do?
I think, to Chris's point earlier, it's an indicator that he respects the technology, and from a voter standpoint, he's having that constant connection, which is important. And kind of tying this a little bit back to the privacy debate, you have companies like Lyft and Uber on the ride-sharing side, and competing with taxis. You have Airbnb on the housing side, and they're going up against regulations that were written either in the horse and buggy days or back in a time when these technologies didn't exist and no one could have anticipated it, and they wrote these laws that maybe made sense in the time, and now they're outdated.
Right.
And you want to make sure policymakers, just like we're now living under a 1986 Electronic Communications Privacy Act, that doesn't make sense anymore today. And so the more that members of Congress and regulators are using the technology to understand how technology develops and changes so rapidly, they're going to be less likely to put in regulations that will be out of date by the time the ink dries on it. And they'll be more likely to change regulations like that are blocking very innovative companies like Uber and Lyft from operating in cities.
Jenny?
I think the other thing that's become really interesting, having come newly into tech but sort of been out in the issue area before too, is that that I think people, when tech first happened, and Rick, I remember, basically the same time when you were on the Hill, when you had one staffer who was the tech person who basically knew how to turn on a computer, and they had to follow.
You mean the person who did the fax machine?
Exactly, and they had to follow the regulations all the way through. I think what is rapidly happening right now, and I think you see it in the NSA debate, and I think you see it in what Michael's talking about with ECPA, is that you can't just like have your tech votes over here and the rest of your issue votes over here. Like the things that sound sort of confusing, members are actually having to engage more inside issues that like touch tech because people are touched by tech more. So look at the NSA issue. You know, a lot of people are talking about government spying on people, that's civil liberties, that's sort of in this realm over here, but there's ramifications on the government breaking into the databases of companies, U.S. companies. I mean, can you imagine in the 50s with Eisenhower if, like, it came out that the CIA and the FBI were breaking into the secret databases of GE? I mean, but yet, because it's like tech and tech's over here, like, I think what we're seeing is like this rapid sort of tech is imbued in almost every issue, and some people try to use it as being complex as a reason not to address it, but it's actually more basic. And I don't know if other people would agree or not, but to me, I was really surprised with how sort of tech is in every issue, and you don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to be Mika or Michael to like understand how a tech bill is going to impact you. And I think Congress is learning that faster. Just like with everything with tech, it accelerates quite fast, but it's kind of this interesting tension right now. I don't know.
There was, yeah.
So, David Almsey with Edelman, and I was formerly the White House Internet Director for President Bush. So what's interesting is just how quickly this stuff has evolved. And to your question about Cory Booker, I think one of the interesting things about that is that it generates press for him, right? So in addition to him using it and directly interacting with his constituents, there's always someone willing to write about the latest tweet as he's running out, saving children from burning houses. These sorts of stories are kind of help tell his narrative, and I think makes him endearing and personal to voters as a person, not just as a politician. So I think that's an important lesson, number one. Number two is, I don't know if Don Seymour is still here, but he was here a little bit earlier. So he was formerly the digital director for Speaker Boehner, and there's a great photo of him, I believe in the New York Times from a couple of years ago, where he's sitting in his office, and he's got two screens in front of him. He's got TweetDeck up on one screen, and he's got the speaker's blog on the other. So it's the value of push versus pull, right? So I think oftentimes Congress makes the mistake of using these channels just to push messages, but they're not engaging with folks in conversations, and they're actually not including these tools to help govern. So Patrick McHenry, congressman from North Carolina, will oftentimes post on his Facebook page, hey, we have a hearing tomorrow with Secretary so-and-so. What questions would you like me to ask him or her? And so he'll take those questions, and sometimes in his testimony, he'll say, I heard from one of my constituents on Facebook, and here's the question. So I think that's when people really start to feel like this process makes a difference. Mm-hmm. It's not just about emails that are coming in or calls or visits up on the Hill, but really using these tools to help govern and help people feel like they're part of the process.
Now, why don't we take advantage of your being here just and giving us some perspective on how far the government has come, and tell us a little bit about what it was like in the White House in those days. I assume it was more like the Flintstones kind of.
Yeah, it was all caves and paint.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
yeah.
I mean,
Did you spend the first few months putting the W's back in the keyboard?
We did indeed.
Right, that's right.
So
And
yeah,
those-
all my emails had no W's, which was awkward. And Russell Litterman, who's here as well, can attest.
And those were the days, frankly, when the president, and bless his heart, but he was calling it the internets. Remember?
I don't believe I heard the phrase internets,
No,
but
that's right. No,
It
he
was
was
the
no-
Google, I think.
yeah, the
But-
Google machine, as Tony Kornheiser likes
Right.
to say.
But tell us what it was like.
Listen, I think, first of all, and, to your point earlier about reaching out to Silicon Valley, I mean, the Silicon Valley of 2005, 2007 is much different than Silicon Valley today. And there's always been a divide between what happens in the tech sector and what happens on the policy side. I think it's gotten better over the years. Part of that is because technology is so integrated in our lives. Keep in mind that in 2005, when I started, I was issued 3 devices, right? So I had a BlackBerry, which was hot off the press, and all I could do was write email with it. There's no web browsing in 2005. I had a pager, because I was a spokesperson for internet press and bloggers, and anytime someone called the White House and I was on duty, you would get a page. And I also had a StarTAC phone that you open up that made the clicking noise. You had the little antenna you had to pull out, right?
Those are cool.
Not quite Gordon Gekko style, but, the next evolution. So, by the time I left in 2007, do you remember the Blueberries? They're a little bit fatter, and you had the color screen. So I was the only one at the White House I was the first one to get assigned so that I could actually visit the website via a BlackBerry mobile device. And the concept of even building a mobile website was so far beyond our concept. Like if it just looked good on a mobile device, we were happy with that. So it was primarily email, quite frankly, so that's what we use mobile devices for. So, and I think things like 508 compliance for those who, hearing or sight impaired, building websites. So government is restricted by that. So, with all the trouble that healthcare.gov has gotten lately, there are a lot of requirements that .gov websites have to meet in order to operate that .com and .org websites don't have to comply with. So, so we are a product of our time. And quite frankly, towards the end of the term in 2007, that's when a lot of these social media properties were popping up. I mean, Facebook had been launched, but it wasn't open to the world yet. It was mostly college students using it, right? Twitter was just, fairly new in 2007, I think, when they officially launched at South by Southwest, which is apropos because I think that's going on right now down in Austin. So we're only 6-7 years now into some of these tools, and so the ability to figure it out in real time was a challenge to us. So we knew it was happening. We looked at it. A lot of us folks launched accounts on the side, but the Presidential Records Act required that anything we posted as an employee of the White House or federal government had to be preserved for archives, and there was no mechanism to do that. There's still not a really great mechanism to do that now. So I think it's really easy to say that the Bush folks didn't get it and Obama gets everything right, but I think you need to take a look at that and say there's still some things that are still being answered. We did things better than what's perceived, but Obama's not doing things as well as it's perceived as well.
I mean, I would just think in the time you were in the how long were you in the White House?
2.5 years.
I would think just from the beginning to when you left, you were it was much more front and center than it was when you got there.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And so, for example, I'll give you a small example. So I was part of the media affairs team, and the Obama administration appointed my role as I guess Macon Phillips at the time was the special assistant to the president, which is a commissioned officer. So I was a director, he was a commissioned officer. So just the role that the internet has played, no matter who had been elected president, I think there would have been a person that would have been a little bit more integrated into the whole operation. So it was important to us, but at the time, the White House website was a one-way communications tool. We were not using social media tools because they hadn't been developed yet.
And you're Macon Phillips today. It's all about social media and Twitter and all that. Yeah. Now that we've made fun of various presidents and politicians, I invite you to let's talk about like one or two Republicans, one or two Democrats who are in the pantheon of really understanding technology and really playing a central, important role in technology policy just overall. I mean, I'd just like to hear some names of who you all really respect in both parties on these issues.
Like, don't put me on the spot for that.
But it's a positive question.
There are a lot, and the number is increasing. I'll just give two right now, just to stay diplomatic. One Republican, one Democrat, and it just so happens that they're both receiving an award, Internet Freedom Award, from our organization in April. In the Senate, Ron Wyden has been terrific on our issues from the very beginning. And in the House, Republican Darrell Issa has been very forward-looking on technology and a great proponent of internet freedom and openness. And he's one that he's posting selfies all the time on Instagram and is very integrated in technology. So those are two that I would
I can't think of two more different politics.
and that actually highlights one of the great things about the internet policy is that our issues really cross party lines, right? Where you can have an issue that, some of the most conservative and some of the most liberal members of Congress and senators will come together on an issue. And, when we go up to the Hill and we talk about things, everybody cares about keeping the internet free, open, and it's not a partisan Republican or Democrat thing, and that's positive. That's what we all want to see here in Washington.
Does everyone here agree with the Wyden-Issa selection or any other nomination?
I'd add another Republican, Eric Cantor, both on the policy side and what he's encouraging to go on inside the House with the members itself. Leader Cantor, one of the things he talks about with members on both sides of the aisle a lot is we spend a lot of money to maintain the Capitol and to keep the grounds nice, and offices spend a lot of time making sure it's decorated nice with stuff back from the district and their state. But what we don't think about is that more people go to congressional websites every single day than walk through the doors. And when you look at initiatives like Citizen Co-Sponsor, which allowed essentially anybody to go to cosponsor.gov and essentially find any piece of legislation, whether it's sponsored by a Republican or a Democrat, and they can support that. and then get updates as it goes through the legislative process, through committee, onto the floor, and through final passage, and whether it passes the Senate or not. And I think that's the type of thing that government needs to be doing, finding people who are interested in stuff and communicating with them about the issues that they care about. Because I think there are a lot of people who have no clue what's being done on their behalf and think nothing's being done, because the main reports that we get out of the media are that there's gridlock in Washington and bills are being passed. So a lot of them are non-controversial, and that's why they don't receive any coverage, and people think that there's nothing being done, because on several issues, we're at kind of a standstill.
So I actually would agree with that a lot, and I think a
With
lot of
Eric Cantor.
yeah, with Leader Cantor, and a lot of that is
Over
around.
Darrell Issa.
I wouldn't say I would say over.
As well.
But the reason I agree with that is not from a policy perspective as much as it's from an adoption perspective. He's got a strong staff that from early on, when he became the leader, took it upon themselves to try and create a more innovative Congress. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot of growth amongst elected leadership. And I would actually say on the Democratic side, it wouldn't even be a member of Congress. It would be Mayor Eric Garcetti, who is leading in Los Angeles, bringing in new innovative roles within the city, and having a lot of cities, a lot of counties, a lot of states have chief innovation officers, and that's great. But how they're taking technology and inserting it into the everyday operation of any of those government entities is going to be how technology moves going forward. And I would even add from our earlier conversation that it's difficult to watch Congress not be able to really look at any sort of technology legislation without it being sort of past the time of moving on to the next thing. And you're seeing state legislatures actually tackle these issues on a daily basis.
Before we move on, any other Democrat on the Hill you would, I know you're not going to suggest a Democrat.
No, I want to, when you're done with this, I got some breaking news I want to throw out.
One more Democrat.
I'll do one more shout out. It's a bipartisan committee, but the Privacy Working Group of the Commerce Committee in the House I will say, has been very interested in being educated on technology issues, especially as they relate to privacy, to bring it back to the first part of the conversation. So they've been more than happy and have reached out on several occasions to both the Internet Association and member companies to ask the tough questions, so that if policy comes out of it, smart policy comes out, and the recognition that perhaps no policy is the smartest policy, to Chris's point about technology outpacing legislation. So, I'll give a shout out to the Privacy Working Group.
Great.
So some of you probably know this because you've got your phones up and laptops, but Mark Zuckerberg, just since we started this conversation, posted on his Facebook page very critical comments about the administration and their privacy policies. I'll read a couple of quotes. He said, "When our engineers work tirelessly to improve security, we imagine we're protecting you against criminals, not our own government. The U.S. government should be the champion for the internet, not a threat. They need to be much more transparent about what they're doing, or otherwise people will believe the worst." And he's vented to the president in phone calls several times.
Wow.
So that sort of happened while we were having this conversation, interestingly enough.
Ron, what's your
Unfriended.
reaction to that?
Did you just friend Mark?
I think Mark just unfriended the president.
Yeah. And some of you liked that comment. Tweeted and came with it.
What do you think?
I actually think that this issue, especially in the Mountain West, is going to start playing a lot more in elections and will play in the 2012 primary. You see candidates like Rand Paul making a stand on this, talking about going after NSA, giving speeches on the floor. You see people like Mark Udall, who've been very aggressive about the NSA, getting attacked from the right for a perceived lack of aggressiveness, even though he's been at the forefront of this issue. I think for states where they have a more libertarian bent, this issue will start to play a lot more about what is the government really doing in terms of its aggressiveness on surveillance. And I think that that's a real issue also for American competitiveness. So you'll see that playing in the West with the technology community, all along the West Coast, from Seattle all the way down through LA.
I think that's a great point, and this is going to be an issue that is going to start driving the electorate, and it is a core issue for American competitiveness. All of our internet companies are global. Primarily they're based here in the United States, but they're all global companies operating around the world. And even before the NSA revelations, there were efforts by foreign countries to have force localization policies and to block cross-border data flows, and both those things are detrimental to an open internet and certainly anti-US companies. And so what happened was they have countries that were pushing these policies, then the NSA revelations come out, and now they're saying, oh, that's the reason why we want to do this, and it's really hurting, you know, our economy here in the United States, and it's hurting this great platform that's free and open that we want the world to have.
Well, this flows right into the internet, and the innovation economy, and explain what that is in your view, and isn't that sort of a euphemistic, happy description that plays to your organization's
Yeah,
PR?
I mean, the innovation economy is, I see it something that is really the future to drive growth and jobs here in the United States, and it's something that touches every other aspect of the economy, going into brick and mortar businesses. And, you know, perfect example, we have Chris from Lyft here, but, you know, companies like Lyft and Uber, Airbnb, and more that are coming along that are part of this, you know, sharing economy movement and creating value in every single town across America. And that's what we want to see, is this innovation that's coming from the ground up, and companies sprouting out with new ideas, and they're disrupting sometimes these incumbent business models that haven't changed or haven't been challenged in decades, and now they finally are. And I think DC is a perfect example. It wasn't until just this year that DC taxi cabs had to take credit cards. And even still, like, if you're in a cab, say, oh, my machine's broken. I mean, that's like the most basic thing. It's like riding in it's like you're in a third world country here in our nation's capital in the taxi system, because they have never been challenged and they've never had any kind of competition. And you have companies like Uber and Lyft and others that are coming around and changing that business model. So now when you go to a cab, it's a little bit cleaner. They're starting to take credit cards. They're, you know, trying to compete, and that's a good thing for consumers.
I also think it's like one of the few areas where, I mean, in a time that the economy has not grown the way that the administration wanted it to, the one sector that did keep growing was tech. And it's not just, I think the other sort of myth out there is it's not just a Silicon Valley thing. I mean, if you look in almost every state in the union, there's a tech incubator hub, there's somebody starting a company in their garage. And I mean, as a sort of economic and political issue, you know, it's a relatively inexpensive way. You don't have to have a lot of capital to start a tech company. You might need it later. You might need it to actually grow it, but to actually start it, you don't. So the barriers to entry are low. You can get a more diverse audience in. And I think you've seen the president, if you listen to his last two State of the Unions, I think we used to always have drinking games during the State of the Union, especially when he had to sit
You used to have what?
Drinking games.
Oh,
You know, you
that's
have
what
to
I thought
sit
you
in
said.
there and like listen to him speak, and like how many times were you gonna, you know, how, you know, what's the key phrase? And this year I wasn't drinking, but I could have been. Innovation, I think he said
We
it
still play those games at the
26
Kennedy School.
I know, exactly.
With the graduate students
I'm
only, and
channeling.
water for the undergraduates.
But, I mean, I think he said the word innovation 26 times. I mean, and you're seeing, you know, him go out with, you know, Connect Ed and sort of in every sort of different aspect, you know, and, you know, that might be political expediency because the unemployment rate is not hitting where it should be, or the Republicans are doing a particularly good job of hitting them on that, but they're leaning in on the innovation economy because it is actually a real thing. And it's a transformation of how our economy is working, and it's again an issue where Congress, some people get it and some people don't, and so.
If technology is so important for the economy, is Washington suitably plugged into the needs of how
Well,
to
I'm going to
do
actually
this?
make me and talk, because that's Main Street patents, right? So you put the word Main Street and patent together in a sentence, like nobody would ever think that anyone on Main Street knows what a patent is. But you have a coalition, right? And you're moving it forward on a tech issue.
Right, so, you know, the patent laws hadn't been changed in 60 years, and then you know, I worked in 09, 10, 11 after I came off the Hill, and it was just a conversation amongst technology, you know, and members of Congress would go, we're not gonna referee, government's not, it's well-suited to pick winners and losers here, so you guys figure it out and decide. So now, fast forward 2 years later, after the first law was passed, there's a whole effort of people who, because technology's just moved into every other business sector, right? So the restaurants and the retailers and the grocers all are getting demand letters and patent trolls, and you're getting some real tangible moments. So you have people like on the left and the right lining up on a technology issue, because it is, you know, there's a million companies in the Main Street Patent Coalition that I've been working on for 10 weeks, and, you know, the only reason why it's not 2 million is I can't get back to the phone to call anybody back, because people are joining the thing, because this is one of those technology issues that has a chance to pass. It's like a handful, there's 4 or 5 issues that the left and right could agree upon. and make something happen so you can get out of the way of some of the innovation challenges that underlie the patent challenges, where the government is slowing people down. The Patent Office takes 4 years to pass a patent. All of these things you can get bipartisan agreement upon and make the thing work. So you know, all my years on the Hill, every member I ever worked for, I worked for Maria Cantwell, who came out of the tech business. And, you know, back to whether you can use the government office or not, if you bother to, you know, she actually had the device and she was barred from walking on the Senate floor with it because, you know, it was like not part of the rules. So, I mean, you're talking about institutions that outlawed, you know, recently as 4 or 5 years ago, the ability to walk around with any of these devices. So you have cultural challenges with these electeds, and you also have a resistance from government officials wanting to pick winners and losers and things they can barely understand. You know, I do work with Pandora, right? So Pandora in 2007 had a tech issue. They had an issue on the way they do their business model, and they had 7 million users. I started working with them 2 years ago. They had 100 million users. Today they have 200 million users, right? The span of 2 years to have the evolution go from that volume. I mean, 2 years ago, YouTube was the biggest data, biggest source of data flow across the internet. Now with Pandora, like, just members of Congress can't keep up with the breakneck speed of all that. You know, Tim Westergaard would go lobby around. He goes, I couldn't get people to recognize me, and I was like, well, my grandkids want me to get a picture with you, and so he'd be walking around taking pictures with electeds because at least he was like the face of Pandora. But it wasn't because they understood what the heck was going on underneath. They just knew that their grandkids were using it, and they were getting them to use it as the technology moved. So it's, you know, some ways it's hard to communicate this with the policymakers because it just moves too fast for them.
How do you, you're pushing grassroots efforts on patent reform, right? I mean, how do you make that of interest to everyday voters? I mean, do people really, I mean, I understand your case about there's bipartisan support and everything, but does Joe voter really care about patent reform? And how do you make it accessible?
I'm fairly certain you're not going to see a lot of TV ads or the third that are get their information about politics from not TV, as we talked on the last panel. But when you have businesses, when you have a mom and pop restaurant that bought a Wi-Fi, you walk in and say, I'd like to have this Wi-Fi offer a coffee. You know, you can come in and use my Wi-Fi while you sip your coffee, and like someone, a patent troll lawyer drops a $50,000 demand letter on you saying we're going to sue you. Okay, now politicians kind of go, okay, now I got mom and pop shops that are on the wrong end of a patent policy. You know, big companies, sure, you got lawyers that can do patent litigation, but if you're a small shop, you don't have a budget. You don't have a budget for taking patent letters come in off of your startup business that's taken off, right? It'd be crippling if the percentage of the money you spent was a third on lawyers. Sure. So, I mean, that's how we're making traction on that side, because it is becoming such a big part of other industries, you know, retailers, grocers, manufacturers, all are having, everybody's got technology in their place, right? The core of the commerce has some sort of application that's using to deal with consumers, and so that's where you know, you might be able to get some policy change because it is so widespread across businesses. I don't know, I don't think it becomes today I wouldn't, when I used to run campaigns, I wouldn't put a campaign ad up about this yet, but in terms of making a policy change, I think you could.
Well, I think, though, both sides of the issue were effective at using internet advertising to get their point across. So if someone went to Google and typed in patent troll or patent reform or the bill number, they would have seen an ad at the top of the search results from a group that was in favor of patent reform and an ad at the top of the search results from a group that was opposed to it. And the idea is that someone who's typing in patent reform is taking a pretty big step of acknowledging their interest in it, and so that's a good time to reach them, and it's pretty cost effective. The groups that were advocating for patent reform, what they did was created an 800 number, a toll-free number people could call, and then they entered their zip code and were directed to the office of their House member, so they could make their views known. So I actually think it's, aside from the points that Michael was making, it's actually a great just case study in how the tech industry was able to use its own tools to advocate for its position and to generate not just an online action, but actually an offline action of someone making a phone call to their House member to advocate for it, who might not have thought about doing that unless they had seen that ad. So that's a really efficient and measurable way to spend your advocacy dollars.
Yes.
It's a range of Freedom Square Group, work with an association and a number of other companies. So 2 comments, one probably a little more cynical than the other. The fact that patents and things like it aren't a voter issue is part of the reason why we can probably actually get something done. You know, it's
Just
something
go
that.
over the heads of the voters.
Yeah, well, no, it's an economic issue.
Yeah.
It's something that every single company who's come to the table, at both the judiciary committees on both sides of the table, they've been able to reduce this to numbers. They've been able to reduce it to jobs they've lost, to customers they haven't been able to service, to innovations they haven't been able to create because it's been going into, this is money that's been going into the pockets of trial lawyers. And so I think that's something that's unique about it. But what's interesting in this debate, and it's something that's kind of permeating every discussion, whether it's been about privacy or you see it about cybersecurity, is that increasingly technology issues are Main Street issues, period. As technology permeates our everyday economy and throughout everything that, whether I'm accessing my transportation on my mobile phone, or I'm using Postmates to get something delivered, or with everything that we're doing, and then just increasingly with autonomous cars and connected cars, everything permeates it. So you're finding, members who never once thought of something as technology, they're looking at how it's creating jobs in their space, and they're seeing that it's important to know about these issues.
I just want to plus one what you said on the bipartisanship, because actually I just started thinking of it when you said it. But it is interesting that I think actually it's not that tech is going over the head of the voters, it's that tech is involved in every part of their lives. So all of the big tech things that you've seen that have happened on a tech agenda are happening in a bipartisan manner. So at the Electronic Consumer Privacy Act, 100,000 people from everyone from Grover Norquist groups to the ACLU banded together and sent 100,000 emails to the White House, which they haven't answered yet, but they did that together. There's 188 co-sponsors of a bipartisan Yoder-Polis bill in the House on electronic consumer privacy. SOPA and PIPA, the big fight of last year. I never in my entire life of working on the Hill ever thought that if a member voted on a motion to proceed that they would vote against a bill on the other side. It's almost impossible. It doesn't happen on the Hill. And you had members of Congress on both sides, actually starting with the Republicans a little bit, I hate to say that with my old D hat on, but who said, wait a minute, this SOPA PIPA thing, these bills may be a little bit too extreme and they were not hearing about it from Michael's lobbyists, no offense to Michael, but they were hearing about it from their 18-year-old granddaughter who was reading something on Reddit and saying, why are you breaking the internet, Grandpa? So if you look at the big moments in tech, they're coming in a bipartisan way, which is, to your point, extremely rare. It is the only vehicles that are moving. And then you look at, it's a little bit more complex with NSA, but you've got Jim Sensenbrenner and, you have these sort of different voices. You have the Intel Republicans and the Libertarian Republicans. You have the National Security Democrats like Feinstein and I do think the tech agenda could probably move the most in the dysfunctional Washington climate these days versus some other people.
That's a headline, dysfunction good for tech. You had a question.
Yeah, I work with David at Edelman, and we do a trust barometer every year. This is not a plug for anyone necessarily, but maybe it is. But we do a trust barometer every year, and in our 2014 barometer, tech is the highest trusted industry in the world among consumers, global, and the least desirable to regulate. And so while I think the tech agenda can move forward, it has to be about incubation and creating jobs in the tech economy, and not about stifling. And so, the ability, I think what we'll see is only things that move that industry forward and move jobs versus things that might, restrict the ability to grow and innovate. So it's interesting, just as we talked about why people might not be, it's not hot on the agenda because consumers are just not banging down the door of members to regulate.
One thing, just back on the patent specifically, the one thing, the lawsuit you hear a lot about is the Apple-Samsung suit, and I wonder if anyone could just weigh in and say, how much does that get in the way of the economy and good policy? What is that lawsuit? What are the implications of that lawsuit for technology innovation?
I think Apple versus Samsung is a separate issue that you have, two large corporate players and they're battling it out. What we're seeking reform on is these entities that are nothing more than a shell corporation with a law firm and, one patent that's not worth the paper it's printed on, going after brick and mortar businesses, small mom and pops throughout the country and throughout the economy and going after them. And so there's, like, the levels, it's very different, so.
But aren't there implications in a suit like that? And aren't there regulatory or legal or remedies?
Maybe some, but it's separate from the focus of what we're trying to do on the Hill legislatively and the problems that you see, small restaurants and even hospitals and retailers and every other kind of business you can think on Main Street USA that they're facing controls.
Let me ask you, all of you, as we get into the heated midterm season, what is at stake for technology and for the industry in these midterms? I mean, you could argue that there's going to be paralysis no matter what, no matter who's elected. Maybe paralysis is good, as some of you said, and to get some things done. Maybe it's not. But does it really matter who's elected in November in terms of your issues?
Well, patents will be done by then, so we don't have to worry about that. I think I could have what we were saying before. I don't think in a lot of ways that, so many of the issues that we're talking about, they haven't really been heavily partisan issues. So, I mean, maybe with the exception of immigration, that's the one I think could, depending on what happens then. But a lot of these really are bipartisan discussions, and it's more helpful to have it go forth that way.
Other thoughts? So do you all agree that if we reconvene in December with this exact same group, there may be a little progress on patents or some of these areas, but we'll have the exact same discussion, and nothing's really going to change? And the elections won't change the focus one way or the other, no matter what happens?
I actually disagree on that. I mean, I think that tech is, again, the issue's becoming more embedded in all the issues that you're talking about. I think the way that an issue becomes baked is it's about a narrative, right? And the tech, or a feeling, I mean, you look at that in presidential races, people vote on sort of their feeling about someone or what the story is that they're telling. And the story that tech is telling is, government, like, don't come in and disrupt our business model, don't spy on us. There's a surveillance problem. It's hampering our ability to expand. On the individual level, there's lots of stuff happening on liberty and privacy. So as it becomes part of a narrative, I think that has changed even rapidly between, the midterms to now. So, but I don't think it's partisan, but I think that you're going to hear more about it. It's just you're going to start to hear, and don't underestimate sort of the tremor that the NSA was, and it wasn't the tremor that everybody thought it was, which is going to be a Patriot Act fight. It's actually turning out to be a business fight. It's turning out to be a globalization fight. The state dinner with Brazil is canceled because of the revelation. You know what I mean? Like, there's more depth inside these issues because they touch everywhere.
But it's not, you're saying there's going to be change and sort of more of a consciousness because of the campaign on some of these issues, but you're not saying it could go this way or that way. You're saying it's
I
just
think it's all going to go towards more understanding of tech.
Yeah,
I think the
yeah.
knowledge goes from 4 people understanding about tech to 24 people understanding about tech to 48 people. It's
Right.
growing like it's.
And to Jenny's point, this is not a Republican versus Democratic thing. So typically when you talk about elections and sea change and shifts and momentum and things like that, you're talking about Republican, Democrat, right, left. What is the momentum of these things on the political side? And I think one of the great things about this industry, the way it's helping the broader economy and the way it's crossing party lines, is that it doesn't necessarily matter if it's a Republican or Democrat. It matters if that person is forward-looking on technology and has, is adopting it and is mindful that this technology is going to change in 6 months, it's going to change in a year, and that you can't get in front of it, try to regulate it or stop it. You need to, help cultivate that kind of change.
She talked about globalization with respect to Snowden, and I think it hasn't been talked about, but data protection.
Yep.
Data protection is the idea that more and more, as Snowden becomes in a forefront issue for other countries, they're going to want to keep all the data in the data centers in their countries. So they won't let, today, it's like FedEx, right? It's the best way to get data from one place to another to serve a customer. And the concern, I think, is that they'll start regulating and making data stay in a country so that it can't flow across borders. And that effectively can stifle innovation. That's one thing that hasn't been talked about, but I think in terms, when you mention globalization, I think that's one thing that will be a policy issue to watch from the trade standpoint.
So one of the things that I think we'll see by the midterms is less of a focus, or at least when it's done, less of a focus on technology was used in the campaign and more of a focus on technology as a platform. And I think that's what you're saying. And I think we see that whether it's on the federal side or the state and local side. Obviously, we work a lot in the state and local level. Is that technology is becoming more of a platform itself in how any government entity is going to change how they're going to operate.
Jenny or anyone else, is there any campaign at any level where technology will be front and center, particularly, that we should keep our eyes on? What? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the race in California, Honda versus Ro Khanna. Yeah, that's the Silicon Valley seat in Congress.
There's also, I think that you're seeing tech increasingly become an issue in Colorado, and then I think also in the Montana race, surprisingly, because you wouldn't expect that, but the NSA issues are expected, and the tech issues related there will play an issue.
I think you're going to see it in the Republican primary, too. I don't know what's going to happen on the D side, but at least there's definitely different mindsets, at least from where I'm sitting on the outside, in 2016, not 14.
John?
Rick, I think the ironic thing between the two sessions this afternoon is that what I've learned is that we spend billions of dollars offering citizens what they don't want, which is like, smarter ways to advertise political messages, right? And we spend almost no money using technology to provide citizens what they do want, which is a greater stake in solving the problems in their communities, right? And the idea of technology as a platform for like every member of Congress to take some of the best practices, whether it's Cory Booker or the House leadership, to actually kind of engage their local citizens, to have online town meetings with restaurateurs to talk about how these issues are impacting kind of their vote and their business and livelihoods. It seems so easy to me, and I don't understand why that more folks in Washington aren't doing that. We have all the technology here at the table, but for some reason they don't seem connected with it.
And my takeaway from this is that all these bizarre things are swirling in my head, which is there's an amazing sort of bipartisan agreement on a lot of these issues, but there's such paralysis that nothing will get done. Yet, because of the paralysis, several of you said that a lot could get done. So, because these are such low-profile issues. So it's this big swirl of, but that's what makes all this really pretty interesting. And we do know that when we do reconvene, whenever this will be, we'll be talking about these issues again. But I do think Jenny is right in terms of there's going to be sea changes in how the public views some of these issues and some of these politicians. And maybe some of these politicians will learn how to use the web.
Great. Well, thank you, Rick, and thanks to everybody for participating in this last panel and all their great insights. Now is the time for an open bar. So Christian, put your hand up in the air. So behind Christian and Tom, there's an open bar, there's food back there, and we want you to stay and continue this conversation over beverages and over sustenance, and we look forward to seeing you all in the next room. Thanks.